for coming to this session. I'm going to start now, if that's okay. This is a final session, actually, of the group Fighting Gender Oppression of Socialism 2018. Can you all hear me okay? Are you all right? Okay. It's really a discussion around Women's Lives Matter, which has become the campaign of the Socialist Party and our programme addressing women and oppression. And to be able to share our ideas of the Socialist Party and our programme, we have some brilliant speakers who've come this afternoon. My name's Angela Waller. I'm from Barnsley Socialist Party and also Barnsley Women's Lives Matter, and I'll be chairing the session. Our speakers are Amy Cousins from Leeds Socialist Party and Leeds Women's Lives Matter campaign in Yorkshire. Amy's been speaking at socialism and feminism meetings in the region and has campaigns in last year to save Doncaster Women's Aid. We have Isabel O'Brien, who's coming from the Glasgow Women's Strikers, who's a home carer in Unison. Hopefully she'll be here, but briefly, to be able to share what's been happening and highlight the brilliant strike last month and also what is happening next and now, basically, in that dispute. And you heard a bit of that yesterday. Jane Nellist is a Socialist Party member in Coventry and is also on the NUT Executive Committee and has been for 2 years and is a prominent campaigner against domestic violence and for women's rights.
Jane.
Jane
Sorry.
Nellist.
I thought you said Jen. I was
Jane? Sorry, my accent's very Yorkshire. Right? If you're not used to it, tough. Jane Nellist, is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, apologise. Before we start the session, I'd like to let you know that we've got to end for 2:40 p.m. for the rally to be able to start as promptly as possible. This is because we need to get everybody in the hall. So, I'll be chairing to try and keep that to the time scale, if that's okay. Trying to get speakers in, trying to get your contributions in, aim to sort of wind the discussion up by 2:20. So, first speaker is Jane Nellist from Women's Lives Matter Coventry and NUT.
Thank you. I thought she said Gin Nellis. I thought she knows my secret. I've actually been on the National Executive 4 years. It seems a hell of a lot longer. But no, it's fine. No, it's all right. I just cherish those years. It was a hard-fought battle to get there. But yesterday was November the 10th was Equal Pay Day. And it recognises that there's 52 days of the year where effectively, until the end of the year, women, compared to men, stop getting paid. It's symbolic, but it's scandalous, and that shouldn't be the case, especially when you look at all of the legislation, all of the battles we've had in the past about equal pay. Now, I haven't got time to go into all the detail, but one of the big issues for women is that their jobs, for working class women, their jobs are concentrated in low pay sector. But even when you look at the top in the BBC, we've seen examples where, female journalists have been paid far less than men. Now, as part of my role on the National Executive of the National Union of Teachers, and we won't be able to say that for long because we're amalgamating and will become the National Education Union. I was asked to run a workshop yesterday at a conference we had in Birmingham about sexism in the workplace. And because in reality, when you look at what's happening in schools and in workplaces, the issue of sexism is huge. And, the Me Too movement, or all of that, it's really exposed that. But my workshop was particularly about uncovering those women in our history, and especially in the trade union movement, who have been some of the best fighters, but they're not spoken about. It seems to be a history of male fighters. And so, we looked at the Cradley Heath women chainmakers, strikers who won, and that's in the Midlands area. They went on strike in 1910. It was a long, bitter strike, but they won 100% pay rise. And what they did was, through their strike action, it laid way for a minimum wage. And, that it's so important. And I'll just flag up this. You can, if you look up women chainmakers, you can download this really excellent document which tells you all about it, which, you could have a discussion around it in your meetings and that. It was highlighting the sweatshops at the time, the forges where they took their babies and rocked them to sleep on the forges while they were making the chains. We talked about Jessie Eden in Birmingham, featured in Peaky Blinders, but actually her fame, she led strike action of 10,000 women in Birmingham. She was a worker in the Lucas factory. There was an 11-week strike about equal pay. The Dagenham workers, the Grunwick strikers, because again, it's not just women, it's black women who, we need to, give them their rightful roles in the struggle. The match girls, the Trico workers, 21 weeks of strike action, again on equal pay. Our history is so rich with strong women who have fought and struggled against the odds and against, some very bitter arguments from the trade union movement itself, from the men who are in control. And we need to reclaim that history and ensure that our young girls are armed with their history. We need a curriculum that does that and, fully support the call by Jeremy Corbyn to have Peterloo on the curriculum and to learn that. So, and of course, when the Glasgow women workers, which you'll hear about later. So the trade union movement is celebrating 150 years, and women have had to fight hard to have a place at that table, and with the resistance by some men. But where, we have been allowed to develop, one thing I would recommend is just to look up a little programme on the BBC, Back in Time with the Factories. I don't know if anybody's watched it. It's quite a good little programme that talks about some of those battles and that. So, but the Trade Union Congress, celebrating its 150th year, it produced a beer. And actually, I had a bottle of beer because I was up for the TUC Congress. And I have to say, it's the most gassiest beer I have ever drunk. I burped the rest of the day. And I think that symbolises what the TUC is about at the moment, that it's all air. And, that's reflected, I'm afraid, in the falling numbers of people who are in trade unions. But women, make up more trade union members, and that's important. We have to build the trade union movement so that working class women are there and fighting. So when we look at the super rich, they're making money off the backs of us, the exploitation. The sweated labour now is in places like Amazon, the warehouses in Rugeley, the warehouse in Rugeley, which is the size of 14 football pitches. The pick rate is so high that people can't go to the toilet. There's a lot of women working in there, a lot of migrant women, so they have buckets to pee in. The conditions in that place are dreadful. And so the sexual exploitation as well. And yet, as we heard yesterday, the boss of Amazon is about to become a trillionaire. It's absolutely scandalous. But then at the other end, we see the Bakers Union and Unite, and we saw the really historic strike the other week with the TGI Fridays, Wetherspoons and McDonald's, and that image of 3 young women representing that strike action, that is the future, and that has to be built. So our role, we have to understand that the impasse of capitalism. We have to unite women and men and pose that need for a fundamental socialist change, that real emancipation of women and social equality. And that has to be the whole of the working class. Bosses aren't stupid. They know the strength of the working class. And that's why they've ratcheted up the anti-trade union laws and in 2016. And I'm afraid the trade union movement has to face the fact, and I think women will be the first to recognise that, is that we have to break those laws. You know, those laws have to be broken if we want to win for our class. So we need more women elected on the leadership of our unions. And our task is to build a united working class movement to transform society. And as I say, women have to be part of that. Now, it's harder for women because still 60% of the work at home is still done by women. So, you know, when we're talking about getting women involved in the trade unions, we have to think about what demands do we need to ask. And perhaps that's something, you know, we can pick up in the discussion. But the meetings, where the meetings are, transport to the meetings, childcare, all of those practical things. The key for the trade unions is to make it easier, to oil that route for women to come up through. And unfortunately, we seem to see some in the trade unions making the same mistakes time after time. Years ago, we had battles in the trade union movement about quotas, and that is coming back in my own union. We have just introduced quotas. And to be honest, for me, I would far rather have a strong working class man who is prepared to stand up and fight than some petty bourgeois woman who is not going to do anything to support me. But I have to say, we've got to get those women in their leadership positions. And what we don't want is to have women in leadership positions that just become part of the bureaucracy and become a block for other women. So, you know, we have the amazing example of Amy Murphy, who fought, you know, real battles to stop her getting elected in Usdaw. But she made it. And, you know, that's really great. So it's not easy, and we have to develop a Teflon coat and sharp elbows to get in there. If you look, you know, at the head of the TUC at the moment, Frances O'Grady, totally ineffective. We need good class fighters in the trade union movement, and we have to make that fight relevant for women. So we have to make issues that women will, you know, respond to. So, as was said, I was involved in the CADV, the campaign against domestic violence. That was about bringing it into the trade unions. So now, you know, workplaces do have policies on domestic violence. They may not be, you know, we need to sort of dust them off the shelves sometimes. I have moved motions at my conference on the menopause, because again, that's something that is a real issue for women. Low pay, equal pay again, childcare, sexism, period poverty. My goodness me, I never thought I'd see the fact that girls aren't going to school because of their periods. It's scandalous. And, you know, we have to have campaigns about that. The trade union movement needs to be at the heart of that. Poverty, housing, huge issues. Pensions, the WASPy women, you know, they are fighters. We need to, you know, bring them into the trade union movement and all of the other things. It's about collectivising those issues. The austerity has had a real, absolute impact on our communities, and women have had the brunt of that. And I think, I haven't got time, but, you know, the home care workers, I know in Glasgow, but in Birmingham there's been a magnificent campaign of home care workers where, because of the cuts, they are going to take thousands of pounds worth of cuts to their salaries, and they're saying, no, we're not. And the people are supporting them. I would argue that to achieve a true liberation and to end the economic and social conditions which exist under the system we live in, under capitalism, an end to all that exploitation and oppression and discrimination, what we require is an understanding of why we're oppressed, and that trade unions are the key to that fight to win, and women have to have full participation in those trade unions. The working class, women have to be there, that's absolutely imperative. And when you look at history, women have been the spark of some of the biggest movements. And in 1917, we saw it when we were looking, you know, at the anniversary, the Russian Revolution. We need a united struggle, and we have to, you know, hasten that day by the work that we do. I'll just finish with a quote from Alexandra Kollontai this was in Russia in 1917 when the women rose up to demand bread and peace. 1917 Working Women's Day has become memorable in history. On this day, the Russian women raised the torch of proletarian revolution and set the world on fire. Our task now is to keep that torch glowing bright. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I think what we want to learn from that is obviously think about questions that Jane's asked of you, if you're in trade unions, about getting involved more in your union, and also come with contributions if you want to about what's been happening in your areas, or some history about women's movement. So thanks, Jane, for that. We've got Isabel O'Brien to speak from the Glasgow Women's Strikes, and we'd like to give her a round of applause for
Oh, I know it has. I've been a home carer for 13 years in Glasgow. I'm a Unison steward for 3 years. I've worked with Cordia and, wait, no, I've got lost. You might think the strike came out of nowhere, but we had been working hard to recruit and building our union in Cordia for years now. We have recruited over 2,000 new members in Cordia alone in the last 2 years and a half. Part of our inequality treatment in our pay was caused by Cordia taking away public holidays, overtime rates for Cordia staff. I was part of the case that fought many years ago. Many of our members didn't realise they had equal pay claims. So we went out into our communities and got them to sign up case forums and put in their claims. In the meantime, we worked hard to build up the strike. On the 23rd and 24th of October, we went out in the streets of Glasgow, and it was just amazing. I mean, you thought that it was just a big party. Everybody got involved. We had all our placards, we had our whistles. It was just absolutely amazing in Glasgow. And the rally was amazing. The speeches were amazing, and the people were amazing. And I hope Susan Aitken heard everything we said, because she knows that we are not going anywhere. We will fight until we get what we duly deserve, and we won't. If we have to take strike action again, we will.
I think if you're following the page of the Socialist Party and on the website, you'll have seen some of the pictures and some of the videos that Isabel described. And personally, I was involved in attending that momentous occasion, and it made my heart beat. And my heart beat so fast, I was tingling. It was amazing.
It was just
It
absolutely
was like a
amazing.
party, and it was
It
loud.
People didn't think they were losing wages. I mean, but when payday comes, we'll know we've lost the wages, but it was amazing.
And speeches
Oh,
as
the
well.
speeches were amazing as
Yeah.
well. And when we came into the thing with the city centre, George Square, everybody was dancing and clapping, and it was just amazing.
Good spirit, and everybody was...
And all we were walking in the march, all the public were behind us. It was
and
just
cheering
kinda-
you on.
Aye, it was amazing.
Right, thanks for your contribution.
Right,
We'll get
thank
to-
you.
If somebody asks you questions, is that
Right.
okay? I know you've
Right.
got to go sooner.
Right, okay.
Right, thanks very much. Our next speaker is Amy Cousins, so thank you.
Oh, I was trying to lift the chair up, but it's not one of those chairs. Comrades, it was estimated in 2015 that by 2020, 85% of all austerity would have come from the pockets of women. However, a report by the Women's Budget Group in 2017 stated that since austerity started to 2017, 86% of all cuts had already come directly from women. In reality, comrades, this has cost women's lives. In a town called Runcorn, not far from where I used to live, a woman died of hypothermia in her home. She wasn't elderly, she was a mum of 2 that had just had her disability benefits cut. She was found sat in her gloves and a scarf and a hat, and she was waiting for her kids to come home because she can only afford to turn the heating on once a day. If this is the current reality, it's terrifying to think of what the death tally of austerity will be when it finally does end. And when I saw that story in the local news, I thought how easily many women in the UK, in the 7th richest nation in the world, could easily be in that situation. How many times I've heard my own mum say growing up, "No, don't worry kids, I'm not hungry tonight, you eat." This is the reality of 21st century austerity Britain for women. Labour, instead of spending time and money on budget groups predicting what the impact of austerity has and will have on women, they need only to have read our many, many publications at the time which clearly stated any cut would be devastating on ordinary people, but predominantly women. Because of women's historically secondary position in society, we are more likely to be the recipients of benefits, but more likely to make up the majority of public sector workers, NHS workers, teachers, all of which jobs have been cut from austerity. But we also perform the undervalued and the underpaid care work in the home, so cuts to elderly care, parks, childcare services also disproportionately affect women. And by the way, these cuts are not taken into that 86% figure because they're deemed not to directly affect women. We know that that's not the case. Particularly disturbing cuts, which I will go on to talk more about, are the cuts to women's domestic violence services. Since 2010, we've lost around a quarter of all refuges. That figure's actually slightly old. I think we've lost more now. And many more support services that are vital to keep women safe have been lost. In the age of austerity, what we have seen is a complete depletion of our services that under the system of capitalism, albeit limited, did help to alleviate some burden for women. In the age of austerity, we have seen councils of every single party cut to the bone statutory, so the services they are legally obliged to pay, and non-statutory services. And worryingly, councils do not have this statutory legal obligation to fund domestic violence services. And so we're in a situation now in the UK where whole counties are on the brink of losing their only domestic violence provision, which has already been limited. Where do women go when they're fleeing domestic violence? The truth is, they either stay in incredibly dangerous situations or they're forced into homelessness, precarious living situations. Shelter quotes that domestic violence is the single biggest reason for homelessness. And many of you might know this, but 2 women are murdered a week by partners or ex-partners. Some of you might not know that a further 3 women a week kill themselves to just escape abuse. On top of this, there are cuts to the police service. Many people that have been through domestic violence or work in that sector know that the police isn't exactly always women's friends in this situation, but they do go some way to keeping women safe, and so the cuts to the police is a cut to women's safety. Whichever angle we look at austerity, it is having a devastating impact on women. However, how has this been met by the labour and the trade union movement? Jeremy Corbyn has put forward real demands that would make a difference to the lives of women no end. But what of Labour as a whole? And there's been a lot of discussion about this, but how disgraceful that Labour MPs have demanded for budget groups to be set up to monitor the effect of austerity on women, yet there has been no out-and-out offensive from the Labour Party against Tory cuts. Rather, from some sympathetic councillors and MPs, we've heard the weak position of our hands are tied and we must wait for a Labour government. But there is no guarantee of that. There is no guarantee that Jeremy Corbyn will be elected, and if he is, we have seen that the right are prepared to block Corbyn any way they can. There is a huge disparity between the Labour Party and the leadership and the PLP, as we've talked about. What the Labour and trade union movement should be doing is refusing to implement a single cut and go on an all-out offensive. The Women's Lives Matter campaign, the campaign after which this session is named, started in 2016 in Doncaster after the last Women's Aid in South Yorkshire lost its funds and closed. For the 8 months that service was closed, so from March 2016 to December 2016, there were 6,623 reported incidents of domestic violence in Doncaster alone. So the Women's Lives Matter campaign was set up by members of the community, service users, volunteers. It was actually Doncaster Women's Aid was a specialist BME service. There aren't actually many specialist BME services outside of London, so it's particularly devastating to the women in that community. So we fought for 8 months to reinstate that service. And because the campaign put pressure on the Labour Council, they were forced into a position to cough up a pitiful £30,000, but which we used as a campaign to set up a new service that was life-saving. And we named that service South Yorkshire Women's Aid to make a political point about how that was the last women's aid in South Yorkshire. Domestic violence services, I can't go too much into their funding, but their grants are now limited from the council. They have to make up their funds through kind of a patchwork quilt of funds. Big Lotto can be a big funder for domestic violence services, but they're not long-term, they're often not secure, and they don't like to be the ones paying the rent. They like to be the service starters or the project starters. They don't actually want to be the ones paying the bills, and so a lot of services, like South Yorkshire Women's Aid, lost out. In 2017, Theresa May, as part of her so-called personal mission to support domestic violence victims, she pledged £2 million central budget for violence against women's services. This was kind of dressed up really shinily, like, look what Theresa May is doing. In fact, this was actually a massive pay cut to the central budget. It's nothing compared to pre-austerity years spending on domestic violence. But actually, the Bureau of Investigative Journalists found that many services that applied for this central pot of money didn't receive their funds, and one county got as little as £6 per woman needing domestic violence support. If anyone knows anything about supporting women through domestic violence, it costs more than £6. If we didn't know this already, Theresa May does not represent equality, and she is no friend of women. After 8 months of being open, South Yorkshire Women's Aid was under threat again. After the Labour Council said that they wouldn't be able to continue to fund the service because they needed to cut the whole of the voluntary sector budget in Doncaster. This was not something the Socialist Party or the Women's Lives Matter campaign could accept. We knew what this would mean to the lives of women in Doncaster. We used a report published by the Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition on how much reserves councils had, and found that Doncaster was actually sat on a pot of about £8 million in reserves. And they made us beg for £30,000. With the political lessons of the Socialist Party, we immediately went on the offensive. Something Momentum in the local area didn't do, and the trade unions certainly should have done with us. We said, do not implement a single cut. Use your reserves as an emergency measure to fund our service, but other services that are vital for all working class people. We said to them, where they could lead, others would certainly follow. They said, they, from the beginning, out and out criticised our campaign. They said that we were damaging Labour's reputation and hindering their personal chances of election. We said not only would a bold anti-austerity campaign massively improve the popularity of the local Labour Party, which was quite frankly shocking, but it would increase the likelihood of a Corbyn victory, because that's why people flocked into the Labour Party, to see a real difference from Labour. And actually we said that if you aren't prepared to do that, then we don't care about damaging your reputations. Move out of the way, or your electorate will know what you have done. And actually, when we did stalls 2 days a week for 4 months, and there wasn't, by the 2 months in, there wasn't a person that didn't come up to the stall that knew what we were talking about. The massive population in Doncaster were overwhelmingly behind us. Through the course of this secondary campaign, not only would the council reps not meet and speak with us directly, they sought to smear and badmouth the campaign. Many members of the campaign are actually Labour Party members, so instead of working with us, they decided to demonise their own membership. This is the situation in many Labour councils across the UK and other supposed Tory opposition parties as well. Plaid Cymru and the SNP have implemented cuts, as I'm sure comrades will know, and they have shown themselves to not truly be on the side of the working class. As Elabilla has talked about, the Glasgow strike, and I hope people ask her questions, but I found it absolutely disgustingly patronising when I read that Susan Aitken, the leader of the Glasgow City Council, said, "These women won their equal pay battle when the SNP was elected, yet they are refusing to pay these workers what they are due." So what do we learn from this? That women need to see an end to austerity now, and that we cannot rely on electoral change. We must organise amongst ordinary women in our communities, as these women did in our workplaces and our trade unions, as Jane has talked about. We must put on the agenda that austerity is not a necessity. This is an argument that socialists might take for granted, but actually it's not necessarily known. It is a tool used to defer economic crisis of capitalism onto working class people. Since the beginning of austerity, the rich have got richer in this country as well. There is money in society to fully fund services, care, the NHS, schools, benefit system, etc. But the ruling class use their political defenders and they will not give up easily. And so as women have learnt time and time again throughout history, from the suffragettes to the Dagenham Ford workers, we have the power to change our own futures, and we do not accept that it is a reality that women can die in their homes from benefit cuts. We do not accept unequal pay, and we do not accept austerity. We're not saying that come the end of austerity, however, that women will be liberated. It is merely the start of what would need to happen to achieve full women's liberation. But Women's Lives Matter are fighting austerity because we understand that's part of the first battle. And actually, since the first campaign in Doncaster, we'll kind of go on to talk more about, other groups have spread, Barnsley, there's organisers in Derby and other parts of the country, and we are now having a national meeting in Leeds on the 8th of December to consolidate our forces and actually put forward a real women's campaign as an alternative to austerity. Because there is no alternative. As long as all parties come from the gains of women, we must be prepared to organise, to say no and to fight back, as the Women's Lives Matter campaign did, and raise the sights of many predominantly unpoliticised women in Doncaster. Fighting is hard, as we found out, but the consequence of not fighting is much harder. As the Glasgow women have shown, women are the backbone of society, and we will fight because we must fight to fight for a society that truly meets the needs of all.